We've got historic and breaking news for the first time in U.S. history. A federal judge has declared that a president of the United States, Donald Trump in this case, has violated the Posse Comitatus Act in place since 1878 to protect the American people from an out-of-control president who's trying to use the force of the U.S. military and military troops on civilian domestic soil and against Americans. And this judge, Judge Breyer, sits in San Francisco, the brother of a Supreme Court Justice, Stephen Breyer. He is not shy. And he has said out loud that the president has, through his actions of trying to take over California's National Guard, but by extension, using that National Guard, using the Marines against Americans for domestic law enforcement purposes, is not only a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, but he says in the first 2 pages of his order that what he's observing is a president that has decided to create illegally, unconstitutionally, a federal police force to take over and use at his command and take over, obviously, blue cities and blue states. I'm Michael Popok. You're on the MeidasTouch Network, hopefully where you go for breaking news stories like this at the intersection of law and politics. Let's get down to the 52-page decision coming off a 3-day non-jury trial last month. We were waiting for this decision. We thought it went poorly for the government, for the Department of Justice's position. And this is the first time in American history that a federal judge has declared such a violation. But more to the point, let me read to you from Judge Breyer's decision. He said on page 1 over to page 2, this actually starts his decision. Congress spoke clearly in 1878 when it passed the Posse Comitatus Act, prohibiting the use of the U.S. military to execute domestic law. That means you can't turn the barrels of the tanks against Americans on domestic soil. Nearly 140 years later, defendants, President Trump, Secretary of Defense Hegseth, and the Department of Defense deployed the National Guard and Marines to Los Angeles, ostensibly to quell a rebellion and ensure that federal immigration law was enforced. There were indeed protests in Los Angeles, says the judge, and some individuals engaged in violence. Yet there was no rebellion, nor was civilian law enforcement unable to respond to the protest and enforce the law. Nevertheless, at defendants' orders and contrary to Congress's explicit instruction, federal troops executed the laws. The evidence in trial established the defendants systematically used armed soldiers whose identity was often obscured by protective armor and military vehicles to set up protective perimeters and traffic blockades, engage in crowd control, and otherwise demonstrate a military presence in and around Los Angeles. In short, defendants violated the Posse Comitatus Act. But he continues. He says, and this is the takeaway, this will be the headline for everyone. Almost 3 months after defendants first deployed the National Guard to Los Angeles, 300 National Guard members remain stationed there. Moreover, President Trump and Secretary Hegseth have stated their intention to call National Guard troops into federal service in other cities across the country, including Oakland and San Francisco here in the Northern District of California. Obviously, referring to threats against Philadelphia, against Chicago, and the rest. But the judge is concerned because he says by doing that, Trump will thus create a national police force with the president as its chief, because there is an ongoing risk that defendants will act unlawfully and thereby injure plaintiffs. Governor Newsom in the state of California, the court enjoins defendants from violating the Posse Comitatus Act as detailed below. Let's back up. How'd we get here? In June, Donald Trump uses federalized National Guard forces and Marines, surges them into California. It was a bigger presence, the evidence showed, than even we did in Afghanistan after 9/11. That's how big of a presence it was. And they were doing things they were not trained to do, not supposed to do, and constitutionally prohibited from doing on domestic soil. In particular, the judge pointed to their own training on page 6 and 7 of this decision, going into the training for what he refers to as Task Force 51, which is a combination of the National Guard and of U.S. Marines. And he says that under their training, they are trained on the Posse Comitatus Act. There's even a slide on page 7 that they use, which lists the prohibited law enforcement functions that they can use under the Posse Comitatus Act, which includes security patrols, traffic control, crowd control, and riot control. In big red letters, we'll put it up on the screen. Those are the things that the Army, military, Marines are trained that they are not allowed to do, that they are prohibited law enforcement functions. And the judge pointed to other testimony during the trial in which people said there was briefing about the Posse Comitatus Act. They understood the limits of it. They understood the exceptions to it, and they needed to comply with it. And then the judge hoisted them on their own petard and said, you didn't. You violated, and you everything on that slide in red, you actually did in violation. Now, the biggest fight here in this case is the power of the federal judge in a Posse Comitatus Act violation. Why? Because the actual Posse Comitatus Act says that if there's a violation of the act, a judge can do one of two things. He can issue a monetary fine, or he can declare it a crime and go into criminal world. But of course, we've got the immunity decision for Donald Trump, which says he can't be charged with a crime. And then in addition to that, we've got the fact that fines aren't going to work. The judge used his inherent authority as a federal district judge to make a declaration that after his trial, that there was a Posse Comitatus Act violation by the defendants, the Trump administration and the Department of Defense, and to stop or block further violations of that act, and then stayed the ruling until the 12th of September to allow the parties to take it up to the Ninth Circuit. Now, one of his audiences for this ruling, which I'm going to post on Legal AF Substack for you to read, is the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and ultimately the United States Supreme Court. In the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, they already ruled against this judge, and he knows that, about the commandeering of the National Guard troops. In fact, this judge ruled that the original takeover of the National Guard, the state guard, by Donald Trump was inappropriate and unconstitutional and violated the 10th Amendment and obvious other parts of the Constitution. He was reversed on that. But in the reversing, they didn't really provide a lot of guidance to the judge. And he critiques the Ninth Circuit for their ruling, but also complies with their ruling to declare, well, you might have found that the Posse Comitatus, that the National Guard was properly taken over by Donald Trump, but you did not address Posse Comitatus, and I'm finding that violation now. But the biggest takeaway from this decision is the judge's conclusion that Trump is trying to create or has created a national police force, an occupying police force to go after effectively blue cities and blue states in order to embarrass them and to flex his muscle. And this is the reason the Posse Comitatus Act, one of the reasons it was created. I mean, one of the reasons it was created was because we still had a war going on even after the Civil War ended between the North and the South was still opposed to giving black newly freed slaves and now black Americans the right to vote. And they didn't want to see federal troops enforcing local law enforcement on their streets. So the Posse Comitatus Act was like, all right, well, whoever's the president is not going to send federal troops, military troops into your cities just to do law enforcement, even if it means quelling riots and different things like that. That's up to your state militia and your local law enforcement. But as applied now, what else stops Donald Trump's lust for power and his abuse of power, if not the Posse Comitatus Act? Even the judge says this is an exception to the Insurrection Act, which gives the president a lot of martial law to use against the American people if there is a true insurrection. Now, while courts have so far deferred to Trump making observations that this is a rebellion, this is a predatory incursion, we're at war, when it comes down to declaring a relatively peaceful protest about an administration's immigration policy and converting that into an insurrection in order to suspend the Constitution and use martial law, that's a completely different thing, even for this United States Supreme Court. So what's going to happen next with this ruling? First time in history that a administration has been found to have violated the Posse Comitatus Act. It's back to the Ninth Circuit on an emergency appeal. It likely goes to the same 3-judge panel, which was not a great panel, to be honest. It was a Trump appointee, a Bush appointee, and a brand new Biden appointee. And it wasn't a great round of rulings for Judge Breyer, but he's a very smart judge and very courageous judge. And in his 52 pages, I think he's threaded the needle to both comply with the Ninth Circuit about their earlier ruling in the case and to find the violation. And, with a pretty airtight evidence analysis after doing a trial. It's up to that 3-judge panel. If they don't like the ruling, some party can also ask for what's called an en banc decision, which is all the judges, all 20 or so judges of the Ninth Circuit making a ruling, and the majority wins before it goes to the United States Supreme Court. But we are heading for the United States Supreme Court, who has been on the sidelines so far, has not weighed in on the Posse Comitatus Act. I mean, as the judge noted, there's only like 3 or 4 cases in the history of American jurisprudence on the Posse Comitatus Act anyway. But they're going to weigh in, and we're going to find out once and for all whether a president can use the Posse Comitatus Act, can violate the Posse Comitatus Act and get away with it. You're on MeidasTouch Network. Take a moment, hit the free subscribe button, slide over to the Legal AF YouTube channel and also the Legal AF Substack, where I will post this 52-page order you could read for yourself. So until my next analysis, I'm Michael Popok. Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.